All right, welcome back from lunch, everyone. Just a reminder, I'm Ariel Zetlin-Jones. I'm a co-director of our blockchain initiative here. I'm also an associate professor of economics here at the Tepper School of Business. We're really thrilled to welcome you to this kind of policy panel. Let me first briefly introduce our speakers and then tell you what we hope to discuss. So to our furthest on the right, we have Dr. Leemon Baird. Leemon received his PhD in computer science here at Carnegie Mellon. He's held positions as a professor of computer science at the U.S. Air Force Academy and a senior scientist at several labs. Leemon's the inventor of the Hashgraph distributed consensus algorithm, co-founder of Hedera, and co-founder and co-CEO of Swirlds Labs. We're really excited to have him here and hear his thoughts about decentralized governance and policy. In the middle, we have Giovanna Massarotto. Dr. Massarotto is an international expert on antitrust, IP law, and economic regulation in the field of information technology. Her PhD is from Bocconi University in Milan, and she's a fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation Competition at the University of Pennsylvania. Finally, but not least, next to me is Professor Michael Madison. Michael's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School here in Pittsburgh and a senior scholar with the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law. So this is a panel on policy. Policy is a very broad topic. We have experts who think about different aspects of policy, and we want to try to turn this into a coherent panel. And so when I think about policy in relation to blockchain, there are a bunch of different aspects. There's sort of the elephant in the room. What is the role of government policy in regulating and managing crypto markets and distributed ledger technologies? There's a more interesting perspective, perhaps, which is what does blockchain do for government policy, which is a topic we'd like to discuss. And a third, especially here at the Tepper School of Business, where we think about the science of managing business organizations, is to think about how distributed ledgers enable new types of governance, whether it's self-governance or policy governance. And so those are the kinds of issues we'd really like to discuss today and see a few different perspectives on. And so what I'd like to do is invite our panelists to kind of start with a brief introduction to help share their viewpoint on these different topics. So let me start with Leemon. Dr. Baird, you're an inventor of distributed consensus-based technologies with over 20 years of experience in tech and startup in the space. Can you share a bit how your background informs your views on the need for sensible policy or governance in this space?
Absolutely. So in governance, of course, it's about making decisions as a consensus. So all the math about how to do consensus is relevant to this. And of course, there's centuries of theory about voting systems, including theorems that say you can't have a fair voting system with more than two options. But all of that is fascinating. So that whole literature on how you do voting systems, how you do consensus systems, we have decades of that, it informs how would you do governance? How would you govern an organization? How would you govern a country? How would you govern anything? And then on the other side, there's the policy from the government. Since I'm involved in a blockchain, in a ledger system, we are very interested in how that interacts with government regulation. We've always been trying to follow government regulation, even though it's hard to tell what it is sometimes. And so that's something we're constantly thinking about. So both sides of that have been very interesting.
Fascinating. I'm excited to hear more, especially about the ways we think these consensus models enable new models of governance. Dr. Massarotto, you're an expert with deep knowledge of economic regulations, especially in the area of information technology. Can you describe some ways you view these new technologies as changing the nature of regulation and policy?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ariel. Thank you so much, CMU, for having me today. It's great to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts on a matter that is immensely important to all of us in the blockchain community, which is the role of also economic regulation. I'm an antitrust scholar with an expertise more broadly on economic regulation and a focus on technologies. And the reason why antitrust and economic regulation is so important for technologies is because it's the first arm of government regulation that can reach any markets without the need to wait for the Congress to enact a new law or establish a new sector-specific regulator. So antitrust can enforce competition principles in any emerging technologies, including blockchain. And this means that it can prosecute monopolies and, in particular, also agreements in restraining of trade that stem from collusion. We heard, like yesterday, especially yesterday, how important is to think of collusion in blockchain. And antitrust is based on concepts like collusion and increasing decentralization. And the reason why I got so interested in blockchain is because the big issue, antitrust issue of the moment right now is related to big tech. So how to handle forms of concentration of power or possible monopolization in essential platforms like Google, Amazon, and so on. And I saw in blockchain the perfect alternative, competitive platform to these large centralized platforms. So I thought, okay, blockchain can be really the competition solution to antitrust problems in dealing with big tech. So rather than having a sophisticated forms of regulation, why we don't use the same technology to fight these big tech? So another reason why a scholar like me is interested and see the potential of blockchain in changing the regulation of information technology is because, blockchain is decentralized by default, by design. So it's a competitive, it really enables to have a competitive market in a sense, it's based on the concept of decentralization, which is one of the key concepts in antitrust. So I see, a great potential from an antitrust and a regulatory perspective in using the distributed ledger technologies in really changing the way we think about policy and regulation in information technology. So and it's I look forward to sharing thoughts and ideas with all of you because I feel it's so important to have a dialogue between technologists and the government because we all aim to create a more trustworthy technology, and so we can really help each other in doing that. So.
Great, thank you. It's so exciting, especially being here at Tepper, where some of the original economic research on how information changes the nature of collusion and monopoly incentives originated. So, it's great to hear this perspective and get a more legal view on these issues. And just before we open it up, Professor Madison, could you tell us a bit about your research on governing knowledge commons?
Sure.
I don't mean to cut you off for a second.
No, go ahead. I'll let you.
Say, my understanding of your area of research is that you think very deeply about the institutions and policies needed to help share common knowledge. And I couldn't imagine a topic more suited to understanding a governance or policy issues in blockchain. So I'm really excited to hear about this and what the framework tells us about how to govern blockchains.
Yeah, the work I've been doing for a long time is finally having its moment. So knowledge commons is the phrase that I and my colleagues use to describe systems for sharing data, sharing information, sharing knowledge in all kinds of different forms and at different levels of an economy or a sector. And we have a mechanism for doing case study-based research, usually qualitative case study-based research. That's, for those of you who know economics history or economics literature, it's motivated by the style of research that was pioneered by a woman named Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. So the idea is that knowledge is shared, data is shared, information is shared, typically in community settings, collective settings. They might be small, they might be broad, they might be more homogeneous, or they might be more distributed, but a blockchain environment is a really great sort of environment for exploring the dynamics of community-based or collective-based data sharing. Just two very, very quick sort of observations coming out of that work. One is that when we talk about knowledge commons governance, that's the way we usually express the concepts. Knowledge commons governance or policy or regulation, those are all aligned concepts. What we learned very quickly is that people mean different things with those words. So this is a conversation today with computer scientists, management scholars, economists, people who are practicing in business and in industry. And if we have a conversation about governance or a question about policy, we're going to have to spend some time figuring out how to level up what we're actually talking about. Because when I say governance, I'm going to have one cluster of concepts associated with that. You may have a different cluster of concepts. And that linguistic, semantic conversation is really critical as a foundational matter. The second thing I would say, coming out of our research, is when I talk about communities, think in terms of layers or hierarchies, right? So blockchain is a kind of foundational layer from a technological standpoint, but on top of that, of course, we can build applications and use cases in all kinds of separate communities, right? So healthcare, finance, higher education, transportation, trade, et cetera. So you've got communities operating on a sector-by-sector basis, as well as a technology community operating at a kind of infrastructural layer, and it's important to be able to see both of those layers simultaneously to fully appreciate the governance dynamics that you can explore and possibly tweak.
Great, thank you. So perhaps a good starting point, as I said, maybe we should think about the role of government in all of these types of systems. We heard yesterday and today a lot about the risks of participating in distributed ledger technologies. If you're trading on a decentralized exchange, you're likely to get front-run. Ben Lifshitz just told us if you're trying to front-run someone on a decentralized exchange, you're likely to get front-run yourself by an ape. Riyadh told us if you hold cryptocurrency keys as a business, you're very likely to lose them and be attacked, and we need to think deeply about the ways we store them. I mean, participating in these technologies is a risky endeavor. It's enormously risky. So unsurprisingly, there seems to be a very simple policy response. Let's try to kind of terminate this whole technology in the first place. But perhaps there are more sophisticated ones. And so I'm curious, both as someone promoting distributed ledger technology and experts understanding how governance works, kind of where do any of you see the role of policy here? Either in, is there a need for it? Should it be promoting these technologies? Limiting the risks people face? Where do you stand on these issues? Who wants to? Someone has to go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
If I may. Okay, I feel the government can play a huge role in really changing the dynamics and ensuring the success of this technology, because I think I see a blockchain as really a breakthrough technology, like the internet, and before that, the telephone, the railroads, the printing press. They literally change the way people interact. So this is great, but on the other side, so on the other hand, we create this breakthrough technology, create uncertainty. So this sense of no control, and the government is often seen as the safe harbor for people that can provide guidance and to understand how to use and to trust these technologies. So I feel the government is fundamental to ensure the success of blockchain. So I think both the government and technologists need to have the humility to understand that they need each other. Because, I feel, the government is played the role model, and it's the reason why we have the government in the first place. So to have someone that can hold someone responsible if he's using a technology in a way that it harms people. So we don't want to create technologies that do bad things, but technology can do bad things. We all know. Can be used to do good, to do bad. So the government cannot change the heart of people, but can make people responsible for bad things and can deter people from doing it again. So this is why I think it's fundamental.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think the government has a role in stopping fraud, but not picking winners and losers. Mm-hmm. And so we want to be very careful about that. We want to make sure that people are not allowed to lie about what they're doing. We want to be careful that people can find out what you're doing so that you aren't running a fraud. They can see what you're doing. But you don't want the government to be always setting what is best practices, these sorts of things, setting standards. That's more for standards bodies or just for it to emerge from the community itself. And so there's always this tension. You want to make sure that the government is able to regulate enough to protect people from monopolies, right? Antitrust. You absolutely want that. That's a case. So that's another good example. I like a free market rather than a controlled economy, but I also like antitrust. Antitrust is what makes the free market be able to be freed. It's a restriction that allows the freedom. And it's the same thing here. The government should be trying to stop fraud and only restricting to the degree that allows the freedom to flourish. And we need to have that same balance.
And I love the fact that you said that the government cannot pick the winner and the loser, because this is what competition is about. And antitrust is not about picking the winner, but it's about making sure that everyone is playing fairly.
So I would just add a couple of quick notes, and I don't know that I disagree, but maybe just add some nuance. One is when we say the government, like which government are we talking about? Right. So there's international organizations, there's regional government. So the EU, of course, has a level of lawmaking responsibility, but then that always gets translated down to the national level. In the US, of course, you have the federal government, then you have state governments, and we have local governments. And so different governments have different scopes of responsibility, different kinds of opportunities. So, for example, Leemon talks about standards, right? Yes, standards bodies are very important, but governments actually have a big role in many parts of the economy. I think healthcare, for example, big role that government plays in standardizing certain technical matters, both for scientific purposes and also for commercial purposes. And we have to understand the government's opportunities and risks and opportunities associated with governments participating in standards decisions, but they do. The government is also a purchaser. So perhaps the most significant but underappreciated contribution that governments around the world have made to technology development over the last 40, 50 years is an actual procurer of technology, right? So we don't want government to pick winners or losers, but at the end of the day, like some company or companies are going to supply the operating systems and other kinds of technologies, and we have to be aware of those dynamics. The other thing that governments do is governments have the power to convene. So even in the context of standards bodies or best practices development and so forth, governments have an almost unique power to bring people together, get people into the room virtually or physically and say, like, this is the objective. These are the problems that need to be solved. You're the people who are going to solve it, and we're not going to leave today unless we have a game plan for what to do next. And I think that in this context, where the technology and its opportunities and risks are still very much in formation, that kind of convening power is something that we really need to seize and take advantage of.
Yeah, and I think something that is very important to understand is that if we want to have a technology that is mainstream, so it's widely adopted, we need someone to regulate the traffic, the flow of traffic, because think about when you have cars. So as long as in a street there are just few cars, you don't really need a traffic light, a speed limit, but if you want to have many cars, so many people using a technology, you might wish to have speed limits, a traffic light. So this is what regulation is about. Right?
And just to give you the microphone, but do we have one street? Do we have more than one street, right? So the character of the regulation changes depending on whether you only have the one highway, and therefore you have speed limits and otherwise traffic, or you have the opportunity for competition. Maybe somebody can build an alternative highway or a grid, right? So I'm in the process right now, I happen to be reading a book about the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, right? So railroads were often regarded initially as public utilities and still heavily subject to regulation, right? Because of the capital investment associated with building railroads. You don't want to have, it would be economically inefficient to have people overinvest in railroads, but that means that you have to have regulation to ensure appropriate access to the rail facilities that are actually being built. I don't want to get too carried away with the metaphor and the analogy, but there are precedents for the kind of conversation that we're having.
And other analogies would be things like the World Wide Web. So it is illegal to do various things online. There are things you cannot put on a website. That is illegal under every government on the planet. But things like the HTTP protocol was not created by the government or enforced by the government. And so there's this role of both things. We want to make sure that we are preventing the bad things that can be prevented by the governments, plural, as you pointed out. Not just parallel governments, but even governments under governments. But we also want to allow the market to control the things that the market can actually control. And so things like what is the definition of HTTP should not be a regulation. It should be something that can compete and the winner wins out.
Yeah, this is great, and I think it really emphasized how important is the role of technologies, because to regulate, the to identify the best speed limit, we need to understand how fast can go a car, and we need to make sure that there is a brake, how easy is to stop a car if we need, and the government doesn't know about it. So the government needs people like you that know the technologies and how to make a technology safe and secure.
I don't think lost on anyone in this room, this debate about how this very large centralized player might impact this supposed democratized, decentralized technology. And yet the government is intervening in its own way already. So we have to confront that, I think. But I want to ask if you have perspectives going the other way, and perhaps if you have some concrete examples, which is, when you talk to policymakers, perhaps not at the executive level in this country, but at more local levels, there seems to be demand and curiosity of how distributed ledger technology might change the nature of policy. Are there use cases where governments can adopt this, or policies that would be improved using this new technology? Can you share any examples where you think this might be particularly fruitful?
Yeah, so there are use cases for governments. Maybe a CBDC is the most obvious one, a central bank digital currency. A government can already creates currency. So the US dollar mostly exists as ones and zeros in the banks of the Federal Reserve System. It's already a digital asset in a sense. But you could make it more of a blockchain, and interoperate with other blockchains and allow it to be flowing more easily. You would enable all sorts of use cases that would make businesses more efficient and maybe allow new kinds of things to be done by consumers that they couldn't do already. A CBDC makes a lot of sense. And many countries are looking at a CBDC. It's not a panacea, it doesn't solve everything, but it, in some ways, could make things more efficient than they are right now. So these are the kinds of things where blockchains can actually help governments, and governments can use them for its purpose. And there's a number of other examples like that too. But I think, yes, I think there are ways in which it can be used by the government for greater transparency. You can broadcast it on a ledger, and then everyone in the world sees the same thing. It can be immutable, so they can't go back and change it later. And it can disintermediate in various ways that make things more efficient. So there's a number of ways that the governments can use these new technologies.
So I would, so at the other end of the spectrum, what I would focus on, and what I have done some research on, is areas of the economy or areas of society where we don't already have highly functioning legal systems, like we have generally speaking in the US, for example, where we don't have highly functioning legal systems that clearly and consistently define the scope of an asset. Right, so in the US, most parts of the US have well-functioning land registries, right? So if you want to buy or sell a house, or you want to buy or sell a parcel of land, what's the definition of that parcel? What are the boundaries? Like, what's the relevant history? Are there liens against that policy? What's the ownership history? In the US, for the most part, changes a little bit as you go from New England over to the Western US, but for the most part, you can buy or sell property in the US with a high degree of confidence that you are buying what you intend to buy, and that what you buy, you pay money for the value that you expect. There's insurance companies, there's banks, there's a secondary and tertiary market in the financing and so forth. There's layers and layers and layers of commercial activity built on top of all this. That's not true, right? Those layers of asset specificity and security don't exist in many other parts of the world. Because they don't have functioning democracies and legal systems the way that we do. So blockchain offers the power to build out. Somebody this morning had code is law on their slide, right? So borrowing the Larry Lessig phrase from 25 years ago, right? So in this sense, blockchain is a kind of governance instrument that could in fact take the place of and be effective in the place of what we in the US have experienced for centuries as a legal system. So I think that is an area where the use case is sort of demonstrably present, whether it's functioning as we imagine it could be is a separate question, but I think the opportunity there is pretty clear.
Yeah, I'm also a strong believer of the use of blockchain to regulate, because I feel really we are living in the age of data. So a blockchain is also called, someone called forever database. It's an append-only data structure, but basically what it does is that it makes everything traceable. And so we can improve data quality, data consistency, coordination among regulators. I deal with antitrust, and antitrust come across all kinds of regulatory policies because it's not sector specific. So we need to regulate also the coordination among regulators, and blockchain can be the ideal tool for regulators to work better, to do what they regularly do more efficiently. So I'm trying, in my field to encourage the adoption of these technologies because antitrust can test these technologies in a specific case, so affect a specific company rather than affecting the entire industry, because it's a case-by-case approach, antitrust. And so this is why I see like an opportunity for antitrust to be the gateway for the government to enter into these technologies. So this is why I feel there is an immense opportunity for regulators, especially to enable regulators to understand what they are speaking about. Because I feel as long as they don't use these technologies, they cannot really understand how this technology works. And we want to have the regulator that speaks the same language of these technologies to enable the regulator to understand what are the best rules.
I love that. And I love the example of the land registration. There are countries where the government just isn't working. And this is a game changer, right? Using blockchains to register the land, you could actually have land registration that people can trust, and government corruption, which is an issue in some places, would have difficulty. It's a game changer. In the United States, we can do without it. You can do a title search and you can buy a house and you don't have to use a blockchain. On the other hand, the blockchain can make it much better. A title search can take weeks and thousands of dollars. It'd be nice to do it in milliseconds and for less than a penny. That would be very nice. And so even here, where we have a functional system, we can make it a better functional system. And in other places where you don't have a functional system, it's just a game changer. It gives you something you don't even have. So I think the blockchain has a role in both of these things. DLTs have a role in producing these abilities for governments that just don't have that ability right now, and for dramatically improving what we currently do have. And you don't have to do title searches where right now the title might be only on paper at a cardboard box in a local office for your county. Blows my mind in this day and age, but this is the way it works right now. We can do better.
So it sounds like a consistent message, and I think we also heard this a bit in Robert Townsend's keynote yesterday, is how blockchains enable you to think about design choices of these types of systems in much broader ways than we have conventionally thought about. What information is public, what is encrypted, who has access, who has the ability to modify the information. So I think it makes us rethink these issues in new and interesting ways. But I want to turn a bit now to blockchain governance itself. And so this decentralized distributed ledger technology turns out, this is a force the economists in the room will not be surprised to hear, turns out to have forces towards centralization everywhere. You see it in the large mining pools. You see it we heard about flashbots yesterday and the amount of blockchain traffic being routed through block builders. More subtly, you see it in some of these decentralized autonomous organizations that are popping up where individuals are collecting a large amount of the voting power of these organizations and effectively acting as centralized deciders on these decentralized networks. So how do we think about governance here? Do we need external governance or internal governance? Is it a bad thing necessarily that these centralized forces keep emerging, that have to keep getting smacked down, or not? How do we think about these issues?
So I'll take the historical angle, which is to say that when you have a shared resource, and in blockchain sectors and blockchain applications, you've got multiple shared resources, you have a need for governance, right? The people, the organizations and the people, they need mechanisms to coordinate with each other. They need mechanisms to resolve conflicts with one another. They need ways to plan their futures together. There's all kinds of problems, social problems to be solved. Governance is our label for systems that we use to solve collective problems. And if you look through history, and this is the knowledge commons work that we've been doing for a long time, governance is decentralized and centralized simultaneously, but in different respects. So I think it's a mistake to imagine that decentralization is some ideal state to be achieved and we need to be constantly swatting away the impulses towards centralization in other respects. So the question is not one or the other. The question is how to harmonize the different features in the right proportion at the right level so that you've got the right governance structure to solve the right problems. So my favorite example historically, sort of how to illustrate this, so this sort of tells you how my mind sort of oscillates between tech areas and non-tech areas, is universities. Right, so most of us in the room are living in universities today or came from universities. So think of a university as a decentralized knowledge production environment. Right? You've got colleges, you've got departments, you've got faculty, you've got students, right? You've got an enormous amount of autonomy in the individual faculty member via academic freedom and academic training and discipline and purpose, right? So most of us who are full faculty at these different universities, like I know I think this way, I don't have a boss. Right, I have to show up periodically to teach a group of students, and I have to turn in grades once in a while, but otherwise I get to do pretty much what I want to do, which is one of the great delights, right, of academic life, not to have that kind of corporate hierarchy associated with what I do. But what each of us does in that individual capacity rolls up into a department. Departments roll up into colleges or schools. Colleges and schools roll up into universities, and somewhere, someplace on this Carnegie Mellon campus, there's a president, and there's a provost. And there's a vice provost or a vice president for research, and there's a board of trustees, et cetera. There is centralized governance to make sure that the students come in appropriately and the students go out appropriately and all the bills get paid on time and the buildings have the lights go on and the IT people show up to do all the great things that the IT people show up. It's simply that different kinds of governance are needed to accomplish different kinds of knowledge-related outcomes. And so I don't mean to say that blockchain is exactly like a university, only to say that this oscillation between different styles of governance is almost an enduring feature of knowledge coordination systems at scale.
So can I just follow up in your analogy? Not to put you on the spot, but so who should be the president of the blockchain? Who should be that margin of centralized control of this distributed ledger?
So I don't know that it needs to be a single person, right? So why is it a single person in most colleges or universities? A lot of it is just history and path dependence. Leemon mentioned HTTP, right? So internet protocols. There's no president of HTTP, right? But we do have, we all know the history of the development of the internet and the protocols, is we do have a trusted community of technical experts that came up with those protocols. Now, there was no election by which those people originally constituted themselves as the issuers of the RFCs. But the history not being to the contrary, we've all sort of accepted this pathway. So oftentimes it's a trusted community that occupies that centralist role. How those people got to that position is negotiable in different settings.
Thanks. Yeah. If I have to think of how to ensure decentralization in a blockchain, I think the key component is the consensus mechanism. So there are consensus mechanisms that I feel tend more to lead towards centralization. For example, delegate proof of stake. So you delegate someone else. So it's not. I feel the logic is not so different from having an intermediary. So I feel there are some consensus mechanisms that can lead towards centralization. And what we can do with my think of doing is to have a kind of, rating, but to say, okay, this consensus mechanism is better for decentralization, so we need to make some trade-off. If we really care about decentralization, I think we need to understand what is the best, or what are the best consensus mechanisms to enable technically decentralization. And I feel this is important because if you take down decentralization from blockchain, honestly, we all know that blockchain is not famous for computational efficiency or for its scalability in the consumption of resources. So we really need to preserve, I feel, decentralization, and antitrust can help. Because can be, the government tool to help the blockchain community in tackling forms of collusion concentration of power, because this is what antitrust is all about. So these are just a few thoughts about how we can ensure decentralization in a blockchain.
I love this. So I think that we as an industry, the blockchain DLT industry, have been somewhat naive from the beginning, and we're just repeating thousands of years of mistakes and learning in a lot of ways. What we've said is, well, we don't want anyone to have any power, we don't want anyone to be in control, we'll just let millions of validators and millions of people contributing code, and there'll be no power, no governance. And what happens is over time, power consolidates, nature abhors a vacuum, you can't have an anarchy, no anarchy is stable. And so what you end up with is a dozen mining pools control all the mining power, and 5 developers are doing almost all of the development. And you have concentrated power in people that weren't exactly elected, aren't exactly known who they are, and they make decisions together, and we don't exactly know how they're making decisions together. So, and maybe that's the best you can do, but I don't think it was the goal when everything was first started. I think that we just kind of fell into it. What might be better is to think at the beginning, how should governance be done right? And then you can say, well, how have countries over the thousands of years said, well, a monarchy is very simple, and maybe a direct democracy would be the opposite of that, but maybe a representative democracy is better than either of those. You can talk about all those things. Our ledger decided to do it with a large number, 28 very large organizations like big universities and big companies that are known, you know who they are. They have a reputation to protect, and they all are guaranteed to have an exactly equal vote, and they have term limits, so they eventually have to leave and new people come in. That's one way of doing it. There are other ways you could do it as well. But the whole point when I started Hedera was to think about governance from the very beginning, and not just have it evolve and let's just see what happens, because we don't want power. Well, you can't say we don't want power. You have to decide how the power is distributed. And you could say, I'm going to set up a new DAO, and I'll let anyone vote. Okay, you're going to get sock puppets voting, Sybil attacks. Oh no, I'll have anyone who holds a token to vote. Well, now you're going to have whales that have too many tokens, and you're not going to know who they are. They have no motivations to do the right thing. You've got to think carefully about the game theory of this system you're setting up. Blockchains are great. We can empower any form of governance you can imagine, but you have to imagine a good one first. And I think that's where we are as an industry right now.
Can I ask one follow-up to Leemon? Because we have him here, and it's a pretty unique opportunity for us. So when you thought about the governance model for Hedera, were there 1 or 2 priority goals that led to some of the design decisions in your governance? Can you describe that process a bit?
Yes, decentralization and transparency. Decentralization is real decentralization. 28 truly different organizations, big ones, universities, companies in different industries, on different continents, under different governments, with different goals, and all of which people know them, and they are going to be self-interested. I've never assumed anyone is altruistic. I would never trust any single organization ever. But I'm trusting them to keep tabs on each other because they're equally big and equally balanced. And everything is transparent. When they talk, the meeting minutes are published, and all of the voting is on chain. Everything is visible. Now, as I said, there's a million ways of setting things up, and you might have better ways of setting things up. But at least think about it before you set it up.
I love Leemon's pitch in 2 respects. One, governance, my experience as a tech lawyer before coming to academia and now studying governance for a long time, my experience is usually that governance is the last item on the checklist, right? The technology, we're seeing this right now with generative AI, right? It's the same thing. We've got this amazing technology, and then somebody says, wait a minute, we need some governance after the fact. I see it at University of Pittsburgh, which is, as many of you know, very heavily invested in health sciences research, medicine, public health, informatics, et cetera. And I have lots of friends in those departments and schools, and so would you be interested in talking about data governance? No, we'll worry about that later on. We just got to get to science. Leemon's example is exactly right. Bake the governance in early. There are people, not just me, there are people out there in law, public policy, other fields who have governance expertise. Invite them into the conversation as part of the R&D process, as part of the commercialization process. You will not regret it. Second thing, though, I really want to encourage Leemon, if you haven't already, please publish what you're doing, both publish the outcome and an explanation of how you got there, but also publish the model. I'm going to intuit, given your training and your record, that you had a very thoughtful, deliberate, analytic process. There's a decision-making model that led to your outcomes. And as you say, you might have achieved different outcomes. But the model itself would be really valuable to have out there as a bit of qualitative case study data, maybe quantitative data or computational data, to say, like, this is how you've done it, for the benefit of anybody else who is coming into the field in blockchain or otherwise and says, I'd like to follow your lead. I think that's a really important contribution that you could make.
And we have a white paper where we discussed those sorts of things. We've also had endless videos where we've talked about what the genesis of it was, what the thought process was, how we looked at how Visa was constructed, which was really interesting. It wasn't a company, it was a bunch of banks doing something. It was fascinating things. We've talked about this a lot. I love talking about it, but I won't take up our last 9 minutes and 49 seconds.
So, as the centralized leader of this panel, before I totally take this over, are there any questions from the audience for our panelists? So you can head over to the microphone if you like. I think we'll let the decentralized crowd take over for a little bit.
It's a nice.
One of the reasons that companies get very large and anti-competitive is because of economies of scale and scope associated with the technology. We've all heard the horror stories about how much electricity gets used in the proof of work concepts involved in mining Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies. It seems to me a centralized processing unit can avoid those costs. But then, of course, you've got, you're losing the competitive aspect. So I wonder, is there a way of balancing some sort of government regulation? Should the government take over processing, the mining process? Anyway, if you guys could address that, that would be great.
Thank you for the great question. I feel, centralization is often good because it increases efficiency. Like antitrust doesn't prosecute big companies because they are bigger, because we don't want to deliver the message that because a company is efficient, is doing something anti-competitive, you need to engage in an anti-competitive conduct. So in thinking about the energy consumption issue, I feel it's an important issue. And when I hear comments about, but it's the same energy that we spend for other things, I feel, okay, this is not the way to resolve the problem. It's a way to hide the problem with another issue. So the way, I think a wise way, a forward-looking way to think of the energy consumption is by thinking of green energy, of ways to find a consensus mechanism that doesn't require such a computational power, but ensure decentralization. So I don't know if you, Leemon.
Oh, yes. So there have been published reports that compare how much energy is used per transaction on different blockchains. We're the best, we're the greenest of them all, millions of times better than the proof of work systems. And then we buy carbon credits to offset that. Okay. Although just buying carbon credits isn't enough. You really should use less in the first place. That's greener. But talking about the government here, I would very strongly say government should not close down Bitcoin because it uses too much electricity. Really, this is something the markets should be doing. And it would be the wrong approach to say proof of work is bad, the government will now outlaw proof of work. That would be the wrong approach. I do think over time, everyone is moving from proof of work to proof of stake because it uses a lot less energy, it's greener, it's good, but that's what the market does. And so that's a case where I would say, don't outlaw it, but allow the market to come to its conclusion, and it is moving towards the greener.
Yeah, no, I fully agree.
I would add one layer to this, which is that independent of blockchain specifically, of course, you've got sort of the economics and history of regulation of energy markets generally, right? So in the US, there's a long, back at the beginning, 100 years ago, right, you have private investment in energy generation, the problem of overinvestment. So you've got regulated public utilities, costs and benefits that economists have talked about for a long time about how you go about structuring energy markets generally. You want to make sure that you've got appropriate incentives to extend technologies for cleaner, greener, more efficient energy production, but you also want to make sure that you don't overinvest in an inefficient way, and you want to protect consumers from unnecessary rate increases. The European experience is very different. The Asian experience is very different, so you've got a lot of comparative history to draw on. I think the blockchain question that you raised could draw on a lot of that history in thinking through the trade-offs associated with different regulatory models, understanding that at the end of the day, you've got competing imperatives. right? You've got economic efficiency, you've got energy efficiency, you've got, just basic cost structures to think about. It's not always a great thing, as Leemon says, when the government gets into the business of telling people what to do. So think about the right governance model relative to this energy question, proportionate to the social problems that the governance is trying to solve.
Andrew?
So I'd like to pry apart, I think you said kind of two nearly opposing views, and want to see if you reconcile them. But one is like, should we accept that some centralization is inherent and then accept it and mitigate it, or should we continually try to push and maintain decentralization? And kind of framing related to that, you seem to suggest that we should be designing a governance that we want from the beginning, as opposed to, say, iteratively trying to maintain it.
Yeah, design it. And there's trade-offs. So pick the right trade-offs. Just don't just hope for the best.
So I guess part of my reaction, consistent with Leemon's, I think, at least in my head, we are, as human beings, social creatures. We just are, right? So we naturally form attachments, we naturally form communities where we live, where we work. It's hardwired from, and the psychologists will do this better than I ever could, it's hardwired into our being. So the centralization impulse that we see in the blockchain space, for example, to my mind, is partly connected to our natural tendency to aggregate our lives with other lives. And then the question from a governance standpoint is, how do we organize that activity, that instinct to combine? How do we organize that productively and reasonably relative to what we're trying to do with the tech and the sector?
Yeah, for sure there is room for research in the field. So. Sure.
I mean, it relates to perhaps this idea that distributed consensus allows for competing versions of governance to emerge. The anecdote, I understand, is from the great book on the block size war, where the ledger itself allowed for communities to come together in their own ways and make a decision of how to govern their model. And you might have disagreed with the outcome they chose, but there was a model there that kind of emerged organically. But that doesn't mean there's not a role for some more, maybe from the start, organic kind of centralized nudges, say, towards a governance model.
I wasn't saying be centralized. I was saying just inherent in how you build the model in the beginning. Yeah.
Well, there's a question of who builds the model, I think.
Yeah. Well, no, everyone builds their own models and then they compete.
Yep.
So everyone can start their own DAO and code into it different governance structures, and then they can compete, and we can see which ones work better.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay. Maybe I'll just start with like a statement, which is that network governance is not the same as regulatory governance. And I think it's a very important distinction. And oftentimes they're incongruent. And I think it's great to talk about advances in network governance. And I think there's also a place for regulatory governance, obviously. How do you merge the two? How do you fix incongruencies, especially when you're talking about like, evolving a network governance model? So, yeah.
Well, both are critical. I mean, they're sort of different questions, but they're both very important.
I guess partly the question goes to my initial observation about what we are talking about when we're talking about governance, right, which is a giant concept that both scales up and down hierarchies, right? So there's application layer, and then there's different layers down below, all the way down to different infrastructural layers. And so it's just important to target your question about network governance versus data governance versus other kinds of governance, like what layer are we talking about? And then there's also the breadth question, right? So are we talking about formal law and formal rules? Are we talking about more best practices or social norms? What's the style of governance, which is more, do we adopt a more decentralized competitive version or a more centralized top-down kind of version? So I don't have a specific answer, except that you've opened the door to another version of, it's a very, very big and expansive topic, and it requires a lot of precision when you get into the details.
Maybe a more precise question is, how do you fundamentally regulate decentralized networks?
I would turn the question around. I'm not quite sure that I agree with the premise, because the premise in some sense is, how does some outside entity assign rules to the behavior of the people in the network? And my way of thinking about governance is that people inside the network are participating in governance via their behavior. Part of the question is making them more aware of the effects and implications of what they're doing, because I would count that as a species of governance.
Yeah, I think you can change the protocol in a way that it's more decentralized. So a way to regulate decentralization is by, changing the protocol.
And it's always, the government is regulating the behavior of human beings. And so human beings should not lie and earn money through a fraud, and they should regulate that. That's slightly different from regulating how the network is working, but it is, sometimes there's overlap. But the purpose of the government is to prevent the human beings from stealing from other human beings. And so that's a little bit different from the network governance, which is making the network work well. So there's some overlap, but it's in many ways different things.
Okay, I think we are exactly on time. So
Good job.
let's take a
governance.
minute. Let's take a minute and thank our panelists so much.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks.
That's great.